Hi, welcome to my channel, Reader Woman. My name's Judy, and let's talk books. In particular, I just finished for my local book club. We just got done reading Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad. It's, yes, a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, as well it should be. It was extraordinary. And of course, with that title, you have to understand you're going to be reading about slavery. I thought that he was particularly smart by focusing on one family. He started the story with the tale of Ajari, who was kidnapped and forced into slavery in Africa. And she was transferred by ship over to Georgia, or over to the South. I can't say that. I have several quotes. So let's start off on page 7. Since the night she, Ajari, was kidnapped, she had been appraised and reappraised, each day waking upon the pan of a new scale. Know your value and you know your place in the order. To escape the boundary of the plantation was to escape the fundamental principles of existence. Impossible. So he brings to life the horrors of plantation life from the slaves' side. Ajari had a daughter, whose name I don't remember, I'm sorry, who, once the story gets going and we focus on Ajari's granddaughter, Cora, come to find out Cora's mother had actually escaped, and successfully. One night she just slipped out. She didn't say anything to her daughter, her young daughter. Cora was very young, maybe 8, when her mother left, and was never heard of again. As you know, the horror of slavery, for me, is twofold. You have these poor people who are basically worked to death. You know, they didn't feed them very much. They didn't care for them at all. They whipped them. They did whatever the hell they wanted to do with them. Of course, the plantation owners were the 1%ers within their societies. But somehow, these white people were able to convince themselves that it was okay to base their businesses, their, cotton fields, their whatever it was, tobacco fields, whatever they were growing, that it was okay to base it on a slave economy, that was just okay. And it was okay to make sure that they couldn't read, that they couldn't write, that, they had no religion, that they had no rights, obviously. And so the moral destruction of those men and women who were on the other side of the whip, it's abhorrent. It just really is. There's no way to soften it just by saying, oh, it was just that time. It's just a piece of history. Yes, I mean, it's terrible that in Africa there were raiding parties who would go to tribes. But I mean, the story starts, and basically, Ajari is the last of her tribe. Her whole tribe is captured, either killed or captured, and they were forced on foot to go over to the harbor where they were put on ships in chains. So yes, it started in Africa, but that doesn't make America any the less culpable. So when I take that seriously, I know that my family, you know, there are lineages that I have Southern families who had slaves. I don't know exactly who or what time frame or anything like that, but I do know that that crime is in my historical past. Just like pretty much any African American knows that their ancestors were slaves. And it's really caused me to re-examine who used to be heroes for me, Thomas Jefferson. There's just no way anymore that I can feel like he is anything more than a very of course, everyone has their light and their dark side. But most people with their dark side do not own slaves. So he is more than just morally ambiguous. He is morally evil. History teaches us that. But I think, too, he should have known it. I think he did know it, but he chose not to do anything about it. He was too comfortable. He wasn't able to save money. He was in vast debt, and that's why he had slaves. So George Washington, another slave owner. Our nation is based on slavery, and this book is quite clear about that. Even the new states, I mean, Texas was a slave state. You have, at least in this book, now I believe Indiana was a slave state originally. There's just a lot of issues that make America morally bankrupt. And this book does a beautiful job of engaging you in that history. One thing that I really liked was how through Cora, he managed to show us the horror of slavery, but how as a slave you still can have that spark of humanity and that spark drive to be more. One quote that came, Cora, when her mother left, she was defenseless, and Ajari had claimed a very, very small plot of land. It was like 3 foot by 3 foot. And when she had died, it had automatically passed to Cora's mother. So when Cora's mother left, no one thought that it should go to Cora. And new slaves were brought in who this big burly man decided, that's mine. And so he built a doghouse in it for his dog. Cora finds a hatchet and she tears that thing down. She cuts his dog and she threatens his life. She knows that the only thing that she has any control over is that 3 by 3 foot plot of land, and that that was hers, passed down from her grandmother to her mother, and now she had to stand up and make sure that it stayed hers. And it was that spirit that ultimately led Cora, with kind of the urging of slave Caesar, who he and his family had been promised freedom by their owner. And she died intestate with no papers, leaving them freemen. So he was sold as a slave. And he talks to Cora about maybe they should run away together to freedom. One quote that really stuck with me was, there was an order of misery, misery tucked inside miseries, and you were meant to keep track. She was in particular talking about house slaves versus field slaves, and even within the slaveries, even within their own culture, you know, whatever was allowed to them, there was still a hierarchy. You may be miserable, but I'm more miserable because I'm out in the fields working. You are in the house. And going back to that plot of land, Cora makes the observation that if they had had any real planning on the slave cabins, they would have spread them out more. It was land, there was land around the cabins, but so really, if they had, each slave could have had a small little tiny plot of land and have grown some of their own food, so they could have survived longer. Of course not. Of course not. Let's see here. So Cora was attached. She was considered a pariah after her mother left, and was forced out of the cabin where she had been raised. And as an outcast, she had to go to the outcast cabin to live. While there, she had befriended a young slave, a young boy, and while she wasn't his mother at all, she just kind of tried to look after him. And during a party that they were having for the oldest slave who was there, who was 50, and he was having a birthday. And as part of the celebration, they were having dancing. Unfortunately, this young boy, the owners, the plantation owners came down and were wanting to wish the old slave a happy birthday and watch everybody dance. And this young boy unfortunately jostled one of the owners' arm and forced wine to be spilled on his sleeve. And therefore, the man started beating this young boy. A feeling settled over Cora. She had not been under its spell in years, since she brought the hatchet down on Blake's doghouse and sent the splinters into the air. This night the feeling settled on her heart again. It grabbed hold of her, and before the slave part of her caught up with the human part of her, she was bent over the boy's body as a shield, where she was beaten in his place. It was after this that Cora agreed with Caesar to run away. You know, and thinking about it, what a huge shift in both of their lives, from actually trying to determine their own future. I thought Colson Whitehead, the author, did a really nice job with making the Underground Railroad a physical thing. I enjoyed it. I really did. It was a bit of magical realism is what a lot of people called it. It added a sci-fi fantasy element to the book, which led throughout the rest of the story. Basically, I felt that everything that took place in Georgia pretty much happened the way it was. But once they get on this railroad, this Underground Railroad, and they come out at South Carolina, and they decide to see what's what there. And they're very pleasantly surprised. It's a good place to be. Excuse me. They forge papers to show themselves as a free man and a free woman. And South Carolina has changed its laws. So there's no longer, well, I don't know if there's no longer slavery, but at least in the big city, they are any black man or woman who can prove that they're freed are accepted. They have dormitories for them to stay in. They teach them reading and writing. They find jobs for them. And at first it seems idyllic. You know, Cora finally gets to learn to read and write. Because, you know, as slaves, they were never traveling unless they were sold. They basically stayed on that plantation until they died. For the most part, most of them were not coming and going. That was not their job at all. And so to have an opportunity to be taught, to have clothing that was decent, not rags, this was a great thing. However, and this is how I think Mr. Whitehead chose to do this, because they go to several states, and he uses each state as a different way. Come to find out, they're in South Carolina. What they want to do is castrate and make sure that there is no procreation, so that the black people will not have children. They also want to do some science experiments on them. So that in and of itself became very problematic for both Cora and Caesar. But one of the things that they did was they would, we're still talking, you know, pre-Civil War, and as doctors, they needed cadavers to cut up and understand how the body works. And so one doctor was with some grave diggers out to harvest bodies. And the white cemetery, the people were causing hullabaloo because their beloved people were being dug up. So what they did was they went to the Negro cemetery. And one quote was, "In death, the Negro became a human being. Only then was he the white man's equal? Because basically his body, his biology was exactly the same under the skin as a white person's. And a doctor could learn just as much from a black person's dead body as they could a white person's. And what a bitter truth. So then the other character that shows up was Ridgway, and he was a slave, a runaway slave catcher, and he would go to great lengths to bring slaves back to be punished or killed by their owners. And in fact, he shows up in South Carolina to grab Cora and Caesar, sorry. And so Cora has to run for it, and she goes to another state, which was North Carolina. Unfortunately, Caesar didn't make it. We are left, I think later in the book, he was killed in South Carolina. So Cora is in a train all by herself, and she ends up in North Carolina. And North Carolina had decided to deal with slavery in a different way than South Carolina. They decided to just basically kill all the slaves and import Irish people to do the slave labor for very low wages. So there is this Trail of Freedom in North Carolina where they have hung all of the slaves who tried to stay, which was also another way that the South dealt with blacks after emancipation. That strange fruit hanging from the tree. You know, it's, well, I can't explain. I mean, the history is really hard. I mean, it's heartbreaking. But the book was something I just could not put down. And probably the last quote I'm gonna read here comes from towards the end. And Cora has ended up in Indiana on a farm that there's probably 100 blacks there trying to start life, working on this farm, trying to keep it going, but they're not quite sure their future and where they should go, what they should do, because they were feeling like the white community around them wasn't happy that they were there. And so they had 2 orators get up, and this came from one of the orators. And America too is a delusion, the grandest one of all. The white race believes with all its heart that it is their right to take the land, to kill Indians, make war, enslave their brothers. This nation shouldn't exist if there is any justice in the world, for its foundations are murder, theft, and cruelty. Yet here we are. And I think my ending thoughts on this book are, it's not necessarily that I believe America shouldn't exist. I think it should. I think all nations are based on murder, theft, not necessarily, and probably cruelty to somebody. Most nations are based on that. However, it's that sense of America of freedom and justice for all that we were taught as young children, and that we learn as adults really is an illusion, and it is not true. And it's a very bitter pill to take, because we want things to be fair. We want things to be fair for us, and we want to know that other people are also treated with respect and responsibility. So this book, it's a great book. It definitely deserved to win the Pulitzer Prize. I hope you read it, and if you do, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And these are only a part of mine, but I've been talking for over 25 minutes and I need to shut up. So once again, The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. No. 5 thumbs up. Go out and read it. We'll talk later. Bye.